It's always wonderful to get applause at the beginning, so I can tell my wife I got an applause. It doesn't mean to say it was at the end. So we're all here to see John O'Sullivan, President of the Danube Institute. Facilities are second to none. If you've not been to the Danube, I would highly recommend. Beautiful place, beautiful conferences to go to. And also the editor-at-large of the National Review, which is actually my favourite American magazine. I was just with Mrs. Kirk, and she showed me the place where Russell Kirk and Bill Buckley met to discuss for Russell Kirk to meet and to write for the National Review. Fortunately, the tavern's now burnt down. Hopefully that's not an omen. Australian Quadrant, also another excellent piece. John has written many books, and he was a special advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And I will leave that there. Everybody, John O'Sullivan.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for your kind introductions. Secondly, let me say it's a great pleasure to be addressing this conference because we have worked, obviously, at Danube Institute with the Margaret Thatcher Centre recently at we were the junior partner in the conference on lawfare in London, and I have to say, I thought, as on this occasion, it seems to be a great success. I say that before I start, so that may change. Now, if there can be a popular view of the connection between Margaret Thatcher and the Anglo-American special relationship, it would almost certainly be that the former was the latter's strongest exponent among post-war prime ministers, sometimes to the point of sacrificing British national interests to wider alliance and American ones. Mrs. Thatcher's relationship to Ronald Reagan is sometimes depicted in that light. It especially was, during her time, by domestic Labour and Liberal Democrat critics. Around the time of the Grenada crisis, Dennis Healey famously said, when President Reagan said, jump, Mrs. Thatcher asks, how high? Friendlier Tory critics, such as the historians John Chalmley and Max Hastings, have argued that Mrs. Thatcher placed an undue or even mistaken priority on that relationship and in consequence was too ready to support Reagan on such policies as the Strategic Defence Initiative and the bombing of Libya. These views are less accepted, less found now than they were when she was in Downing Street. But they persist, and it must be acknowledged that there is a substratum of truth in them. But they amount to a truth not confined to Margaret Thatcher. All British Prime Ministers since Churchill, and arguably since Lord Salisbury, have yielded ground to the United States, both when it was a rising power and a dominant one, when they judge it to be in either wider alliance interests or overriding long-term UK interests. Mrs. Thatcher was not exceptional in this regard, but she was franker than most of her former colleagues in her admiration for the United States, and because of her ideological sympathies with Ronald Reagan, she sometimes started out with a more favourable view of his policies than either her own foreign secretaries or other European leaders. That said, all that said, the popular picture of Thatcherite attitudes is at best exaggerated and at worst simply false. A truer account would be to say, 1, Mrs. Thatcher believed the special relationship was the single most important element in British foreign policy. 2, this was because it was the clearest and best and clearest way of serving British interests and British values worldwide. 3, in her premiership, it did that most of the time. 4, in that respect, she was very different from the Prime Minister to whom she is often compared when the special relationship is under discussion, namely Tony Blair. And 5, the result of their different approaches was that she left the special relationship in better repair than she found it, and he left it very much the worse for wear. To justify these assertions, let me consider the nature of the special relationship. We can date its birth precisely. It was born in January 1941 in the North British Hotel in Glasgow, when Harry Hopkins, who was returning to Washington to report to FDR and to advise on how far to extend US aid to us, gave a small dinner party for Churchill. When he rose to speak, he said that his guests were naturally curious about what he would say to Roosevelt on his return. Well, he said, I'm going to quote to you one verse from the Book of Books. Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Well, that led very directly indeed to the August 1941 meeting of Churchill and Roosevelt on British and American destroyers in Canada's Placentia Bay, where the two statesmen signed the Atlantic Charter and sang literally from the same hymn book. When that was accomplished, there was the public transformation of the full English-speaking civilization into a military and diplomatic alliance. Now, there had been intimations of this earlier. Lord Salisbury had initiated a diplomatic policy of appeasing the Yankees at the time of the Venezuela's crisis, which culminated in the entry, and that policy culminated in the entry of America in the Great War on the side of the Allies. It was, in short, a successful policy of appeasement. This approach continued into the 20s, when the British sacrificed their long-standing naval alliance with Japan at the 1928 Washington Naval Conference, basically to keep the US happy. Patrick Buchanan's much misunderstood book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War, argues persuasively that this decision undermined Britain's imperial interests in the East, notably its link with Australia, and created for British military planners the costly nightmare of a dual military threat in Europe and the Far East. But these early intimations of Anglo-Americanism faded with the Great Depression, from which Britain recovered more quickly than America, but recovered by policies that the Americans disliked and interpreted as anti-American. Cordell Hull even described a modest imperial preference tariff as the most hostile anti-American act in my lifetime, which, given America's history of tariffs, is an extraordinary remark. But in 1939, the kind of sympathy and commitment expressed by Hopkins 2 years later did not exist. On either side, the principal members of the Chamberlain government were, if anything, mildly anti-American, and it's doubtful that the US would intervene in Europe. They took that view. And anyway, Roosevelt was hostile to the British Empire, as indeed he continued to be during and after the war. What changed all these things was a series of dramatic events. The fall of France, Hitler's domination of Europe, the arrival of the fervently pro-American Churchill in Downing Street, the seeming rise of an existential threat to Britain after May 1940, though in my view, the imminence and directness of that threat has been exaggerated by historians. And finally, the helpful intervention of Japan, which simply removed isolationist opposition to American entry into the war. The cooperation promised by Hopkins in Glasgow became fully operational. The special relationship Mark I, deep cooperation in military, diplomatic, and intelligence to defeat Hitler, had been established, and like Salisbury's appeasement policy, it too succeeded. Hitler was defeated, and the threat to Britain and America seemingly evaporated. There then followed what Churchill's greatly loved private secretary, Jock Colville, later called the fatal hiatus. This was the period of utopian illusion in the victorious powers that followed the war and that concealed from people the growing Soviet threat. During this period, the special relationship did not disappear. The forms of cooperation remained, but its political character became a sentimental celebration of wartime comradeship. Churchill's Fulton speech in 1946 was designed, among other purposes, to dispel this utopian illusion, to alert people to the new Soviet threat, and to propose a reinvigoration of the of the wartime alliance to meet these new realities. The fostering, there are other elements in the Fulton speech, for instance, the fostering of European unity, but at its heart is the proposal for the deepening of Anglo-American cooperation across the board to resist communist aggression and subversion. The speech was not well received in America in 1946. Democrats on the left and former isolationists regarded it as a bellicose attempt to get America to prop up a failing British Empire. Truman held temporarily aloof. As with Japan at Pearl Harbor, however, the Soviets moved things along. Their takeover of Eastern Europe by salami tactics converted skeptics to the need for the United States to return to the continent and to establish resistance to the Soviet advance. Far-sighted strategists like James Burnham, who advanced an almost identical set of policies in his book, The Struggle for the World, in 1946, prepared American opinion for this change, and bold political leaders like Truman, Marshall, and Aitchison, strongly backed by Ernest Bevin, and from the opposition, Anthony Eden, created the Western institutions that won the Cold War. Pause for a moment, however, to consider what those institutions were. NATO was a multilateral alliance designed to hold the central front in Europe. It succeeded triumphantly. The OECD was a multilateral economic alliance to oversee the revival of West European economies. It succeeded triumphantly. The European was not a Cold War institution, but it had strong US support in order to create a more integrated Europe, and until recently, it succeeded quite remarkably. All of these bodies, however, were Eurocentric. They were detached from the anti-communist struggle in the rest of the world. Often their leaders were hostile or indifferent to US efforts to fight communism elsewhere, which after 1968 they began to interpret modishly as imperialism. By contrast, the special relationship, though informal, was a worldwide enterprise. Until the mid-60s, the Brits remained a significant power in the Far East. While the US fought communist guerrillas in the Philippines and Vietnam, the British actually defeated the Malayan communists in a 12-year campaign. The British fought in the US-UN war to protect South Korea. They defeated the Indonesian attempt to annex Borneo in the 1960s. And until the 1970s withdrawal from the Gulf, they kept the peace and stabilized relations there. Simply by sending a battalion to Kuwait in 1961, the Minister for War, Jack Profumo, later very famous, deterred an earlier Iraqi invasion of the stateless. And of course, we fought in both Gulf wars. To be sure, there were failures and disappointments and massive disputes in this relationship. Suez, worst of all, but also the British refusal of Lyndon Johnson's request to send at least a battalion of Black Watch to Vietnam. But by and large, the two powers supported each other's efforts to defeat communism and to stabilize unfriendly hotspots. And we watched each other's backs diplomatically. That was the reality of the special relationship from 48 to the arrival of Mrs. Thatcher in Downing Street. It had been left in reasonably good health by Jim Callahan, who was so pro-American that he was widely suspected of being the CIA's man in the House of Commons. And though Jimmy Carter and Mrs. Thatcher would never be soulmates, they helped each other through the crises that came their joint way. She gave him strong public support over the Iranian hostages issue, and she was stronger than any other European leader in backing his sanctions on the Soviets over Afghanistan. But that's not saying a great deal. But the degree of sympathy, understanding, and mutual interest took a huge upward leap when both Thatcher and Reagan were securely in place as heads of government in 1981. This solidarity of leadership was rooted in three facts. First, Mrs. Thatcher was strongly pro-American. She had visited the United States in the late 60s as part of the Distinguished Visitors Program run by the State Department, and she had been greatly impressed by the technical efficiency of American industry and the dynamism of American society. That was the kind of enterprising society she wanted Britain to become again, and she felt at home there. Second, Reagan was pro-British in a somewhat different way. He had a slightly sentimental view of Britain as a land of kind hearts and coronets. But he had come to political maturity at a time when the British were fighting gallantly for their lives in 1940. That had left its mark. He saw the Brits as tough beneath the gentility. I suspect also that as someone, in a sense, maturing in Hollywood, his view of the British Empire had been coloured red by those great successes of Kipling in British imperial presentation, the Corder brothers in Hollywood. Third, both Reagan and Thatcher had recognized at the first meeting in 1975, just 1 month after she was elected Tory leader, that they were ideologically close. They would differ on points, but they expected to be in general agreement on the great issues of the day, namely the Cold War and the revival of capitalism. They therefore found the special relationship a very useful instrument as a result of three of its factors: the military interoperability, the presence of the CIA London station chief at meetings of the Joint Intelligence Committee, the worldwide electronic system echelon, and all the habits of cooperation between governments were suddenly infused with a new and potent enthusiasm. One might almost say that there were two special relationships: the government-to-government one and the personal relationship between President and Prime Minister, and that each strengthened the other. Neither of these relations was without tensions. Both developed over time. It's known, of course, that Mrs. Thatcher occasionally spoke disparagingly of President Reagan's intelligence. Nico Henderson, Norman Lamont, and others have quoted her to this effect. But these quotes come, I believe, from the first few years of their joint leadership. Her view of Reagan evolved. She was initially contemptuous in private of the president's apparently detached style of leadership. He seemed quite simply not to be in command of his brief by her scholarship girl standards. When he succeeded all the same, she was somewhat baffled. And when that happened repeatedly, she had to reassess her first judgment and to recognize that he was exercising a different kind of political leadership than she had to exercise in a parliamentary and debating context. I believe that her final judgment in her memoirs, "It was easier for lesser men to underestimate Ronald Reagan," is the disguised admission of that early era. Her mature view of Reagan and of their relationship was probably best expressed by her foreign policy advisor, Sir Percy Craddock, who contrasted the two leaders as follows. 1. The bossy, intrusive Englishwoman, lecturing and hectoring, hyperactive, obsessively concerned with detail, versus the lazy, sunny Irish ex-actor, his mind operating mainly in the instinctive mode, happy to delegate and over-delegate, hazy about most of his beliefs, but with certain stubbornly held principles, a natural warmth, and an extraordinary ability to communicate with the voters. Yet, as Sir Percy went on to say, these different personalities complemented each other very well. They were not oil and water, they were oil and vinegar. No prizes for guessing who was which. As for the government-to-government relationship, this was one between states, and states inevitably have different interests, especially when they are operating in a worldwide context. When we stand back from the years 1981 to 1989, however, we can see the cooperation between these two people led to remarkable historical changes for the better. I will briefly say what I believe to be their two signal achievements. First, the peaceful end of the Cold War that enabled millions of people to live free lives. Second, spreading through the world of a new and more vibrant information-based capitalism that led to billions of people, especially in Asia, leading more prosperous and hopeful lives. My judgment is that President Reagan was principally responsible for the first achievement, but Mrs. Thatcher for the second. It is mainly her economic policies that the rest of the world followed later, not his. That leads naturally into a discussion, however, of the disputes that occurred between between Thatcher and Reagan during the 8 years of cooperation. All those who have written extensively, acknowledge Jeffrey Smith's 1991 book, in which he spoke to everybody. They were all around at the time, in order to find how that had worked. Of course, they acknowledged that there's the disputes between them, namely the Falklands War, the Grenada crisis, the Soviet gas pipeline dispute, the US budget deficit, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and what Mrs. Thatcher saw as Reagan's willingness to trade away the West's nuclear deterrent at the Reykjavik summit with Mikhail Gorbachev. One should point out, however, that, as Smith points out, that these disputes were conducted in a calculatedly careful way. Mrs. Thatcher never pulled her punches in private about her opposition to Reagan on these issues. She had an artful way of doing it. She would complain. He's sitting there, and she would complain about one of his aides. Jim, George, I can't see why you're doing this. Well, Reagan, as I say, the man who was doing it, was sitting just opposite her. This meant she could be tough substantively, without forcing a personal confrontation. But she would, and did, dissent forcefully, as people like Richard Pearl have ruefully confirmed. He says, as far as he could see, it wasn't that Mrs. Thatcher yielded too much to the American government, it was the other way around. She was, however, usually more circumspect in public on the gas, even though she, for example, on the gas pipeline and on Grenada, she was highly critical there as well. In fact, she introduced a bill prohibiting British companies from observing US sanctions on the gas pipeline. When Reagan was in trouble at home, she pulled her punches, even, for example, and stepped out to give him strong political backing. In an interview during Iran-gate with CBS's Leslie Stahl, she told the interviewer, "Don't be so gloomy. You're living in a great country with a great president." It's a kind of intervention in US politics, which is somewhat unusual. But it won plaudits in the White House. He was threatened at the time. 4, she lost some battles, but she won some too. Won some she should not have won, given the disproportion of power between the White House and Number 10. On one famous occasion, she waited for the last moment of her discussion, which had gone well, with Reagan, to produce from her handbag a little list at the end, looked at the last item and said, "Oh, arms for Argentina. You won't, will you, Ron?" His aides had prepped him to be firm and say that he would, but he said, "Oh no, of course not, Margaret." and that was that. In short, Mrs. Thatcher went beyond what was necessary in pursuing the policies that reflected either joint US-UK interests or wider alliance interests, or the President's political standing. She fought fiercely for British interests when they were ignored or resisted by the US or the President. She won a larger percentage of these battles than she should have done, because she was such a stout friend on most other things. And she generally exercised a strong influence on the administration that, as Smith pointed out, senior officials and departments would actually seek her support on some issue because they found it might help them to convince the president. No other statesman, not even Churchill, has exercised such influence on the internal workings of the American government. Mrs. Thatcher's success in this regard can be compared to another prime minister who is often seen, especially by Americans, as a paragon of the special relationship, namely Tony Blair. Obviously, there are points of similarity between both on how both prime ministers treated the US relationship. Yet it's worth pointing out that when she left office, the special relationship was stronger than before. When he left office, it was seriously weaker. British opinion was more anti-American, and the consensus at the top of British politics was that Britain should probably be more cautious and perhaps detach herself from future American interventions. Why? Very simply, Mrs. Thatcher always fought for British interests, and she defended her foreign policies in those terms. She was not averse to citing international law when it suited her, or other justifications in the Falklands War, but she made it clear that the purpose of the task force was to free British citizens and to recover British territory. By contrast, in the Iraq War, which is the equivalent, I think, his equivalent to Thatcher's Falklands, Blair almost never defended his policy in terms of patriotism and the national interest. Instead, he presented two other main justifications. Britain's obligation to the international community and international law, and the need to buttress our alliance with the United States. Thus, the few conditions he laid down for British participation in the American venture reflected not British interests, but progressive supranationalist opinion, and such as pressing Israel to make concessions back to the Palestinians and going to the UN Security Council for stronger backing. But unless there was either British interest or obligation involved in Iraq, and in my view, historically, there were both, British people would see little reason for sending British troops in harm's way. To justify invading Iraq, because it would please America, might suffice to justify an easy and early victory. But it could not maintain public support for a long and uncertain anti-guerrilla campaign, and it proved, in the event, to be an excellent strategy for weakening the special relationship. Blair doubtless regretted that. But the special relationship always came second to him, to Britain's commitment to the European Union in his list of priorities. Whenever there was a clash between the two, as for instance over the EU's plan to develop an independent European defence organisation threatening NATO with duplication and diversion of scarce military resources, he invariably sided with Brussels. Indeed, he exploited his credit with the United States, gained by his support of the Gulf War, to persuade the Bush administration into going along with Brussels. Well, maybe we shouldn't be too surprised. No conceivable reform could have made Blair President of the United States, but at the time, his name was occasionally floated as possible European president. Whatever Blair's conscious motives, he left the special relationship weaker, and she left it stronger. And those different outcomes arise more or less directly from their different visions of what it represented. I think she saw it as an extension of British patriotism to a wider but still natural set of loyalties to the English-speaking world. He saw it as a useful historical relationship, but a fading competitor to the wider patriotism of a European nation still striving to be born. Let me now concede, however, that Mrs. Thatcher's support for the special relationship is a theme in her career that makes her, I quote, controversial, as well as great. As an element in UK foreign policy, the special relationship has accumulated powerful and sceptical enemies. Let me briefly list them. Other European nations resent the special clout and particular advantages it gives Britain in world politics. France, for instance, has regularly sought to bring echelon the worldwide electronic eavesdropping system operated by the 5 Anglosphere countries under some kind of international supervision. Paris, Berlin, and other European capitals see echelon as ultimately incompatible with a common European defence, intelligence, and foreign system, which I think it is, incidentally. Secondly, those British politicians in all major parties who want the UK to commit itself to a European federal state believe the special relationship gives London delusions of grandeur that obstruct the necessary surrender of sovereignty. Third, the State Department has traditionally, things are changing at the moment, thank goodness, but the US State Department has also traditionally disliked the relationship as an obstacle to Britain's full absorption in the European Union, which since about 1960 that has been was a plank of major policy. Foggy-Bottom thinks that an unqualified British commitment to European political integration would make Europe more pro-American. We would be, in that vision, the Trojan horse for America. In reality, it is far more likely to make Britain more anti-American as it absorbs the ethos of European politics. Then left-wingers just dislike the closeness of this means for, closeness to capitalist America. Some conservatives blame it for Europeans' post-war retreat from world power and its replacement as a world superpower by the US starting at Suez. I regret that, but I just think we were adapting to the inevitable. That's that. And foreign policy realists deplore it as a relationship built on sentimentality, something which, according to the best international relations theory, should not happen. Almost all these groups want London to replace the US with EU as Britain's closest ally. The occasional exaggerated reports of the death of the special relationship is really in part due to their hopes and influence. How then, finally, does the special relationship manage repeatedly to survive this kind of skepticism? I think is rooted in 3 enduring features. First, Britain and the US, and countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, share a common language, culture, and legal and political tradition. As a result, they tend to see the world in much the same way. The so-called Anglosphere countries tend to believe in a liberal international order, free trade, free capital movements, global consultative institutions, and so on, and identify the same threats to it. That has obviously ceased to be true in the last year, and that's interesting, as we shall see. Second, both countries have been historically more prepared than others to use military force to uphold an international liberal order and their own interests against fundamental attack. Third, since 1941, Britain and the US, and again countries such as cooperate in similar fields, have maintained these kind of relationships to a high degree. So dense and overlapping are the established links of cooperation between these countries, as James C. Bennett argues in the Anglosphere Challenge, that they form a network civilization of nations that begins increasingly to think, act, and even develop alike. They link not only governments, but also private sector bodies and ordinary citizens. Trade, investment, and migration patterns are far closer between the countries of the Anglosphere than between them and third parties, and since the Second World War, the core of the network civilization has been the special relationship. It's a practical relationship that benefits both sides. Echelon has been mentioned. More generally, Sir John Scarlett, when he was head of MI6 in the early 2000s, told a parliamentary committee, he was head of MI6, the UK agencies' long developed relationship with US intelligence agencies give them vital access to US intelligence and resources. It is neither practical nor desirable, nor in the national interest for US agencies to carry out counter-terrorism work independently of the US effort. Intelligence sharing is a very significant indicator of alliance closeness because of its secret nature. But it is merely one element in a much broader defence relationship. Both the British Armed Forces and the British defence industry benefit greatly from their privileged relationship with more technically advanced partners in the... what time is it now? Okay, thank you. I asked for that. In both senses. Both the British Armed Forces and the British defence industry benefit greatly from this privileged relationship with more advanced, technically advanced partners in the US. It helps explain why Britain has been the leading important military power in Europe for most of the last 50 years. From London's perspective, then, the special relationship has special advantages that no other alliance or set of alliances could quite replace. It would be strategic self-mutilation to get rid of it. From an American perspective, Washington gets a dependable ally with high diplomatic and military skills and worldwide influence. When Peter Rodman, a distinguished Kissingerian realist who served in high foreign policy positions in every Republican administration since 1968, was asked about the latest reports of a broken special relationship, he said, "I wonder if that's a story that's been planted by either the Quai d'Orsay or the Wilhelmstrasse, since every other European nation is jealous of how Britain is able to work both sides of the Atlantic to increase its world influence." Did this die with Mrs. Thatcher? After the period in which she and Reagan achieved this astounding success, and I don't think, frankly, we should expect that kind of historical set of developments to come along regularly. It was a remarkable period with a remarkable triumph. But after he left office and Bush came in, most observers assumed that she would continue to enjoy the same kind of personal relationship with President Bush, because they had been friends during the previous 8 years. They liked each other, and they seemed to be on the same broad ideological wavelength. But it didn't work out that way within the first year because of a dispute to be settled in NATO over what kind of nuclear weapons were based in Germany. Just as I was in Washington at the time, I remember all this vividly, but in the run-up to the summit, Bush originally began by sympathizing with Mrs. Thatcher. He was conducting his own review of foreign policy prior to jumping into NATO politics. The first smoke signals that emerged from the White House suggested the Bush administration would actually be tougher than Reagan, which might have helped Mrs. T, who since Reykjavik was worried that US policy had been dangerously flexible on nuclear weapons. But quite soon, a different song began to be heard. The Brits were too obstructive. They, not only on NATO, but also on European integration. Germany was the leading economic power in Europe. That would now have to be reflected in US policy. And Thatcher, though admirably brave and principled, was rigid, preachy, and increasingly isolated within the alliance. And Kohl, a loyal ally, needed NATO's help to stay in office. It became clear. For some reason, I seem to have, as I predicted, I've lost my place, but what the devil does that matter? Because I'm a run over as well. So, there came a moment, I had the quote here, which I will use now, in which she lost that battle. In Charles Moore's brilliant biography of Mrs. Thatcher, he tells the story of, he goes to interview Charles Powell. Obviously, you all know Charles was her most loyal and also her most powerful ally on foreign policy. And they discuss the result of Mrs. Thatcher's defeat at the 1990 NATO summit, I think. And Charles expresses regret. It's the end. It was the end, he said, the end of that. And interpreting him, Charles Moore says, he meant it was the end of the period in which Anglo-American politics had dictated the future of the world and brought about this great success. Well, I think we must expect, as I've said a moment ago, that these kind of successes don't go on indefinitely. You run into patches of difficulty and so on. But actually, I think both Charles were wrong there. That was their despair there was the result of the fact that Bush had a special necessity to help to save coal and to side with the Germans that year. The next year, the Gulf War came along. Germany was not much of a help in the Gulf War. It didn't have an army, it didn't have an intelligence service, and it has a funny kind of national personality that doesn't really want to go abroad. We know why. Now, as a result of that, the relationship between Britain and America, and I have to say France, those relationships warmed up very quickly, and the relationship with Germany cooled down. And I've got tired of waiting to see the emergence of Germany as America's most important ally in Europe. It's promised again and again and again, but it never seems to happen, and I don't believe it's going to. I think the relationship I've been describing, in which Mrs. Thatcher played a key role, and we should remember her with gratitude for it, is one of great importance to our country and to the other country. That leaves me to say one thing, which is, everything is now changing. This will not carry on indefinitely. We're moving from one period to another. But there is one interesting thing, which is slightly, counterintuitive, but which is important. It looks as if the President of the United States, the great disruptor, is in fact a secret card-holding member of the special relationship. He seems to like us more than he likes anybody else, and he keeps making us offers which British Prime Ministers keep sort of trying to avoid accepting. We see this clearly with Starmer, but also I think it's true of Theresa May. She had a great opportunity which she just did not pick up because she didn't want to embarrass herself by being too pro-American and too anti-European. I will leave it at this case. I'm optimistic, therefore. Thank you very much.